Welcome. Today we're diving into the fascinating world of logical fallacies. These are errors in reasoning that can sneak into arguments and discussions, often without us even noticing. Understanding logical fallacies is crucial for anyone who wants to think critically, debate effectively, or simply avoid being misled by faulty logic. Throughout this video, we'll explore different types of fallacies, see real-life examples, and learn how to spot them. By the end, you'll be equipped with tools to strengthen your arguments and recognize weak reasoning in everyday conversations. Let's get started on this journey to sharpen your mind and boost your critical thinking skills. Logical fallacy is a flaw in reasoning that weakens an argument. These mistakes can be subtle or obvious, but they all have one thing in common: they make arguments less reliable. Fallacies can occur in any context: debates, advertisements, news, or even casual conversations. Sometimes people use them intentionally to persuade others, while other times they happen by accident. Recognizing fallacies helps us separate strong arguments from weak ones and makes us better thinkers overall. Let's look at some of the most common types you'll encounter. Ad hominem fallacy occurs when someone attacks the person making an argument, rather than addressing the argument itself. Instead of focusing on the issue, the discussion shifts to personal traits or characteristics. For example, if someone says, "You can't trust Jane's opinion on climate change because she's not a scientist," that's an ad hominem attack. It doesn't address Jane's argument or evidence, just her background. This fallacy distracts from the real topic and weakens the conversation. Always focus on the argument, not the person. Strawman fallacy happens when someone misrepresents or oversimplifies another person's argument to make it easier to attack. Instead of engaging with the actual point, they create a strawman version that's weaker or distorted. For example, if someone says, "We should have stricter regulations on pollution," and the response is, "My opponent wants to shut down all factories," that's a straw man. The original argument wasn't about shutting down factories, but about regulation. This tactic avoids real discussion and leads to misunderstandings. Appeal to authority fallacy occurs when someone claims something is true simply because an authority figure says so without considering the evidence. While experts can be helpful, their opinions aren't always correct. For example, "This diet must work because a celebrity recommends it," ignores scientific evidence and relies only on fame. It's important to evaluate arguments based on facts and logic, not just who is making the claim. Always ask for evidence, even from experts. False dilemma or false dichotomy fallacy presents only two options when more exist. It forces a choice between extremes, ignoring other possibilities. For example, "You're either with us or against us," suggests there's no middle ground. In reality, most issues are complex and have multiple solutions or viewpoints. Recognizing false dilemmas helps us see the full range of options and avoid being trapped by oversimplified choices. Slippery slope fallacy claims that a small step will inevitably lead to a chain of related events, usually with negative outcomes. For example, if we allow students to redo one test, soon they'll expect to redo every assignment. This reasoning exaggerates consequences and ignores the possibility of reasonable limits. While it's important to consider potential outcomes, not every action leads to disaster. Look for evidence before accepting slippery slope argument. Circular reasoning, or begging the question, happens when the conclusion of an argument is simply a restatement of its premise. For example, "I'm trustworthy because I always tell the truth." This statement doesn't provide any new evidence, it just repeats the claim in different words. Circular reasoning fails to prove anything and can make arguments sound convincing without actually providing support. Watch out for arguments that go in circles without real evidence. Hasty generalization occurs when someone draws a broad conclusion based on limited or insufficient evidence. For example, "I met two rude people from that city, so everyone there must be rude." This fallacy jumps to conclusions without enough data. It's important to gather more information and consider exceptions before making sweeping statements. Avoiding hasty generalizations helps us form more accurate and fair opinions. Post hoc or false cause fallacy assumes that because one event follows another, the first caused the second. For example, "I wore my lucky socks and then aced the test, so the socks must be lucky." This reasoning confuses correlation with causation. Just because two things happen in sequence doesn't mean one caused the other. Always look for real evidence of cause and effect before drawing conclusions. Appeal to emotion fallacy tries to persuade by triggering feelings rather than using logical arguments. For example, "You should donate to this cause because you'll feel guilty if you don't." While emotions are important, they shouldn't replace facts and logic in decision-making. Recognizing emotional appeals helps us stay objective and make better choices based on reason, not just feelings. Bandwagon fallacy suggests something is true or right simply because it's popular or everyone else believes it. For example, "Everyone is buying this phone, so it must be the best." Popularity doesn't guarantee quality or truth. It's important to evaluate ideas on their own merits, not just follow the crowd. Being aware of the bandwagon effect helps us make independent, thoughtful decisions. Red herring fallacy introduces an irrelevant topic to distract from the original issue. For example, during a debate about school funding, someone might suddenly bring up the weather. This tactic diverts attention and avoids addressing the real argument. Recognizing red herrings helps keep discussions focused and productive. Always steer conversations back to the main point when distractions arise. Appeal to ignorance fallacy claims something is true simply because it hasn't been proven false, or vice versa. For example, "No one has proven aliens don't exist, so they must be real." Lack of evidence isn't proof of anything. It's important to base beliefs on positive evidence, not just the absence of disproof. This fallacy can lead to unfounded conclusions and should be avoided. False equivalence occurs when two things are compared as if they are the same, even though they have significant differences. For example, saying, "Eating too much sugar is just as bad as smoking," ignores the different risks and effects. This fallacy can mislead by oversimplifying complex issues. Always look closely at the details before accepting comparisons as valid. Appeal to tradition fallacy argues that something is right or better simply because it's always been done that way. For example, we shouldn't change the policy because it's tradition. While traditions can be valuable, they aren't always the best reason for continuing a practice. It's important to evaluate ideas based on their merits, not just their history. The appeal to novelty fallacy claims something is better simply because it's new or modern. For example, this is the latest technology, so it must be the best. New doesn't always mean improved. It's important to judge ideas and products on their actual value, not just their novelty. Being aware of this fallacy helps us make more balanced decisions. False cause or non causa pro causa is when someone assumes a relationship between two things means one caused the other. For example, crime rates dropped after a new mayor took office, so the mayor caused the drop. There may be other factors involved. It's important to investigate all possible causes before making conclusions about relationships. Loaded question contains a hidden assumption that makes it difficult to answer without appearing guilty. For example, have you stopped cheating on tests? Implies the person has cheated before. This fallacy puts people in a tough spot and can unfairly influence conversations. Recognizing loaded questions helps us respond thoughtfully and avoid being trapped by assumptions. No true Scotsman fallacy changes the definition of a group to exclude counterexamples. For example, no true Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge, and when someone points out a Scotsman who does, the response is, well, he's not a true Scotsman. This fallacy protects beliefs by redefining terms rather than addressing the argument. It's important to recognize when definitions are being unfairly shifted. Appeal to nature fallacy argues that something is good or right just because it's natural or bad because it's unnatural. For example, natural remedies are always better than synthetic ones. Nature isn't always best. Many natural things can be harmful. It's important to evaluate ideas based on evidence, not just whether they're natural or artificial. Appeal to consequences fallacy argues that a belief is true or false based on whether the outcome is desirable or undesirable. For example, if there's no afterlife, life would be meaningless, so there must be an afterlife. The truth of a claim doesn't depend on its consequences. It's important to separate facts from feelings about outcomes. Genetic fallacy judges an idea based on its origin or source rather than its merits. For example, that theory came from an unreliable website, so it must be false. While sources matter, the content of the argument is what's most important. Always evaluate ideas based on evidence and reasoning, not just where they come from. Middle ground fallacy assumes that the compromise between two extremes must be the truth. For example, if one person says the sky is blue and another says it's red, the middle ground would be purple, but that's not necessarily correct. Sometimes one side is simply right. It's important to evaluate claims based on evidence, not just by splitting the difference. Tu quoque or you too fallacy responds to criticism by accusing the other person of the same thing. For example, you say I shouldn't lie, but you lied last week. This tactic avoids addressing the original issue and shifts focus to the other person's behavior. It's important to deal with arguments directly rather than deflecting with accusations. Appeal to fear fallacy tries to persuade by scaring people rather than using logical reasons. For example, if you don't buy this insurance, you'll regret it when disaster strikes. While fear can be a powerful motivator, it shouldn't replace facts and evidence. Recognizing appeals to fear helps us make decisions based on reason, not just anxiety. The appeal to flattery fallacy tries to win agreement by complimenting someone rather than providing real reasons. For example, you're so smart, you must agree with me. Flattery can be persuasive, but it doesn't make an argument valid. Always look for evidence and logic, not just kind words. The appeal to spite fallacy tries to persuade by exploiting negative feelings such as anger or resentment. For example, don't support that policy, remember how they treated you last year. This approach relies on personal grudges rather than logical reasons. It's important to base decisions on facts, not just emotions. The appeal to wealth fallacy assumes that something is better or more accurate just because it's associated with wealth or rich people. For example, this must be a good product because it's expensive. Price and wealth don't guarantee quality or truth. It's important to judge ideas and products on their actual merits, not their price tag. The appeal to poverty fallacy is the opposite of appeal to wealth. It assumes something is better or more truthful because it's associated with poverty or simplicity. For example, this idea must be right because it comes from humble origins. Poverty doesn't guarantee truth or value. Always evaluate arguments based on evidence, not just their background. The composition fallacy assumes that what's true for the parts must be true for the whole. For example, each player on the team is excellent, so the team must be excellent. Sometimes the whole is different from its parts. It's important to consider how parts interact before making conclusions about the whole. Division fallacy is the opposite of composition. It assumes that what's true for the whole must be true for its parts. For example, the team is excellent, so every player must be excellent. This isn't always the case. It's important to evaluate each part individually rather than assuming they share all the same qualities as the group. Gambler's fallacy is the mistaken belief that past random events affect future ones. For example, I've flipped heads 5 times in a row, so tails is due next. Each coin flip is independent and previous outcomes don't change the odds. Recognizing this fallacy helps us make better decisions in situations involving chance. The appeal to probability fallacy assumes that because something could happen, it will definitely happen. For example, it might rain tomorrow, so the event will be ruined. Just because something is possible doesn't mean it's certain. It's important to distinguish between possibility and probability when making decisions. An appeal to force fallacy tries to persuade by using threats or intimidation instead of logical reasons. For example, agree with me or you'll lose your job. This approach relies on fear rather than evidence. Recognizing appeals to force helps us stand up for reason and resist manipulation. The appeal to pity fallacy tries to win support by making people feel sorry rather than providing logical reasons. For example, you should give me a passing grade because I worked so hard. While empathy is important, it shouldn't replace evidence and logic in decision-making. Recognizing this fallacy helps us stay fair and objective. The appeal to hypocrisy or whataboutism fallacy tries to discredit an argument by pointing out hypocrisy in the opponent. For example, you say we should recycle, but you don't always recycle. This distracts from the argument and focuses on personal behavior. It's important to address the issue directly, not just the person's actions. The appeal to silence fallacy assumes that if someone doesn't respond or provide evidence, their position must be false or true. For example, you didn't deny the accusation, so it must be true. Silence isn't proof of anything. It's important to base conclusions on evidence, not just the absence of a response. The appeal to motive fallacy dismisses an argument by questioning the other person's motives rather than addressing the argument itself. For example, you only support this policy because it benefits you. While motives can be relevant, they don't automatically invalidate the argument. Focus on the reasoning, not just the possible motives. The appeal to ridicule fallacy mocks or makes fun of an argument instead of addressing its substance. For example, that idea is so ridiculous it doesn't deserve a response. Ridicule doesn't prove anything. It's important to engage with arguments seriously and respectfully, even if we disagree. The appeal to popularity fallacy claims something is true or good just because many people believe it. For example, millions of people can't be wrong. Popularity doesn't guarantee truth. It's important to evaluate ideas based on evidence and logic, not just how many people agree. The appeal to antiquity fallacy argues that something is better or true simply because it's old or has always existed. For example, this remedy has been used for centuries, so it must work. Age doesn't guarantee effectiveness. It's important to evaluate ideas based on current evidence, not just tradition. The appeal to complexity fallacy claims that because something is complicated, it must be true or false. For example, this issue is too complex for you to understand, so just trust me. Complexity doesn't guarantee correctness. It's important to break down arguments and look for clear evidence, no matter how complicated the topic seems. The appeal to personal incredulity fallacy argues that something must be false because it's hard to believe or understand. For example, I can't imagine how evolution works, so it must not be true. Personal disbelief isn't evidence against an idea. It's important to seek understanding and evidence, even when concepts seem difficult. Congratulations, you've now explored a wide range of logical fallacies, from ad hominem attacks to appeals to popularity and complexity. Understanding these common errors in reasoning will help you think more clearly, argue more effectively, and spot weak arguments in everyday life. Remember, the key to critical thinking is to evaluate ideas based on evidence and logic, not just emotions, popularity, or tradition. Keep practicing these skills and you'll become a more persuasive and insightful thinker. Thanks for joining this journey into the world of logical fallacies.